So the one thing about who's all in this audience is a pretty wide variety of folks, from state government to municipal government to landscape architects, planners. So, so questions. What do you, based on what you've heard, what are some of the things that you wonder about first about the opportunity for Rhode Island to take greater advantage of these opportunities? Any questions? Don?
I'm sitting here thinking about the common thread amongst all the different ways to commute, and especially with Whitford Junction, fascinated with the work that the students put into that. And it seems like the smallest little piece, physical piece, may be the biggest reason for success or non-success, and that's really the condition of sidewalks, or if there are even sidewalks available. I drive through Whitford Junction all the time. Here's the big facility, ready to go, to take way more passengers, but there's no sidewalks that connect to it. You can't even walk underneath the bridge to get to it. So I'm hoping your students are really looking at...
There's a map in there. They mapped out where there were sidewalks, where there's no sidewalks, understand the conditions of them, because pedestrians are one element of the multiple mobilities we're talking about. You know, pedestrians, bikes, autos, buses.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's got to have a part in that, and it's certainly walkability is key.
Right. We often say walkability, but it never gets right down to the nitty-gritty of what that sidewalk condition is, how wide it is, if it's even there. So I found it interesting, in Dan and your before and after of the roadway connection at the airport. If it was all about the sidewalk, the comfort, the width, that must be just a huge success story going from before to the after. So, I mean, we think, you know, buses and trains, and that's all the sexy stuff, but it really comes down to the sidewalk.
So there's clearly a lot of variables that go into making TOD work. And maybe one of the biggest challenges for us is just getting all the partners to be rowing in the same direction, right? Because it requires all of those things happening. Some of them are going to happen more quickly than others. Some of them are going to happen after the fact, in the case of sidewalks, for example, in Whitford Junction. That may even be an example of, that was an investment that occurred perhaps even before the community thought about the impact it could have in their community and what they really wanted out of it. I think that might have also been one of the last earmarks that occurred in Congress to fund something like that. So, yes. And by the way, because I want to just make sure that there's the list of everyone who's here in the room, please take one with you. And if you don't mind, when you ask a question, if you could just identify yourself. Thanks.
My name is Bianca Policastro. I'm a consultant. I work primarily with municipalities and nonprofits in Kent County and Providence County. And this is more of an observation, because one of the things that I do for the municipalities and for nonprofits is grant writing. And there are a lot of different studies, and feasibility studies, needs assessments. And so when I hear things like, how do we get people to walk more? How do we get people to get up their cars and get on a bus? And what I've noticed is that a lot of the studies that the state departments do come out and they're siloed. So if you work in planning or in transit, you see your studies. But maybe you don't see the studies being done by the community action agencies on the community-based needs assessments or the health equity zone studies. And not that I have a solution to this, but I think that if someone, say from Grossmart or Department of Administration, put out a call to the agencies just within the state who are funding these studies and said, could you send us your studies and then look at compiling them? So, when, like, as a grant writer, like, I'll pull the SCORP. I'll pull the health assessment study done by the heads. I'll look at the TOD study, and I'll pick out bits and pieces to get a grant application that looks fundable either to the state or to the feds. And I'm saying, okay, like, all these people in the room, but they're not talking to each other. They're all talking about the same thing. And so I say that both as somebody who's working for the city of Pawtucket. I'm working on the Broad Street Regeneration Project, Pawtucket, Central Falls, and Cumberland. But I also work for the community action agencies of West Bay and CAP. And we're handling the case for bikes for Grossmont. And so trying to get all you guys just to look at the studies, I think it would really benefit you.
It's a great point.
You know,
it's a great point.
It's just an observation.
No, it speaks to the need to have everyone sort of rowing in the same direction.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
because if you do things more siloed, everyone's sort of going off doing their own thing. And this kind of a project, I'll call it a project TOD, does require people working together.
Yes, and
No
I
doubt.
just think even if just looking at those studies like jointly would really help. And you wouldn't have to spend so much time and dollars replicating some work that maybe Department of Health or DOA or the Statewide Plan already paid for.
Exactly. So one of the things that I wanted to point out too is that we showed the list of the places that we're doing a deeper dive into for TOD. And you might think, why is Pawtucket, Central Falls not there? Because it's going to be the site of a pretty significant investment coming up in a little over a year with the opening of a commuter rail station. And it's because they were ahead of that curve. They had to get out and accelerate the planning and the analysis, and they have been doing that. That's why it's not a focus, but we are looking at the things that are happening both in Pawtucket as well as in Warwick, because those are two communities that have been out there doing a lot of this groundwork. Other questions? Paul?
Hi, Paul Rosario, Oroville Land Trust. I'm encouraged by an overall appreciation for both the built-up community and the non-built-up, the natural environment. And this is going to be a very messy question. But what I don't...
Who's it directed to?
All of them, all of you. The messy question is from maybe a 50,000 foot view. Why are we always looking for more? So why are we looking for more sidewalks? Why are we looking for more infrastructure? Why are we looking for a bigger this or a bigger that? When in many situations a lesser something might actually be a better approach. I'll leave that messy question just the way it is.
I'll go first here. So I specifically am absolutely not asking for more. I love the case for infilling historic villages. They have existing sidewalks. They have existing water and sewer lines. They have existing transit service in many cases. And I guess on the other end of your question, from a reductionist standpoint, that does mean less new development. It means less expenditure running water and sewer lines out in the middle of what used to be a field. Yeah, same team, I guess, is my point.
I would agree. Dan, you first.
If I can just follow up too, our particular project, we have water, we have sewer, we have infrastructure. Roads, we need some sidewalks, we need some redevelopment. But we're also looking to capitalize on our location, on the transit, the tremendous public transit investment at the airport and in the interim. So our particular project, we're looking at focused development in a particular part of the city. Well, at the same time, we have a new 125-acre park at Rocky Point. We've acquired Dolly Farm, Martin Farm, multiple pieces of land within the city to protect. So it's almost a balancing act. We're trying to focus development in an area that has infrastructure in place.
And I would agree with that. And just that, I mean, the whole smart growth movement is about using existing resources to their most potential before, one of the people who was a founder of Grossmark 20 years ago was Jim Dodge with Providence Gas. And he understood the math of extending pipes out further to serve a lower density neighborhood. And the cost per person just a lot higher. So I think we're about taking advantage of what already exists, where maybe there's been disinvestment over the years and there can be some revitalization. But yes, you do need some core infrastructure to make that work. And that's transit, it may be upgraded infrastructure, it's upgraded sidewalks, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's more. In fact, I'd say that the sprawling development that we witnessed from the sort of the 70s into and actually post-50s up until the early 90s was actually creating a whole lot more infrastructure that we didn't need to. Other questions, thoughts?
Well, I'll do one more if I can. So how does this all relate to kind of the electrification of everything? Particularly bicycles, buses, cars. I haven't heard anything about smaller roads or maybe offsets for driverless vehicles to go closer to residences.
I feel like that
You're
one's
just right
to
to
the
this one, right?
So I guess I'll start by answering part of your first question. You know, why more specifically related to transit? I think, you know, from our perspective, there's a push at a state level to get people out of cars, even if not explicitly stated. I mean, the state has very aggressive climate change reduction goals. There's always talk about more rail service, and frankly, if you're riding a train and then you get to where you're going and it requires supplemental bus service to support that. And so I think we're always pushing for more transit and better sidewalks, because those are the fundamentals of how you get people out of cars. It's not adding Wi-Fi, it's not electrifying vehicles. It's providing a fundamentally good service that they want to use. I think the electrification part plays into that is important, but I don't think that it's the driving force, because if you talk to our riders, they're going to, you know, an electric vehicle costs about double what a regular diesel bus costs. And if you ask our passengers, would you take fewer buses, but if they didn't have any emissions, would that impact your, you know, would you prefer more buses or less emissions? They're going to pretty uniformly say, we'll take the more buses, please. We think it's important. I mean, it's definitely part of our mission to help achieve the state's climate change reduction goals, but it's a difficult sort of nuanced conversation, because it does come at an added expense, and it does have a lot of limitations. The technology's not there yet. You know, the buses that are being marketed get about a third of the distance that we get on our current vehicles that can be commute all day, and it adds operational expenses. You don't have to pay to bring your bus back to the garage and swap one out that's fully charged. So you have a bus that's twice as expensive and takes 2 times as many buses to provide the same amount of service. It gets pretty complicated, but we're committed to it. I mean, we've got 3 electric vehicles on our property. We've been a recipient of some of the VW mitigation funds. We're actually the state's primary recipient of those funds. We have about $10 million there. We have, we just received a federal low emission, no emission grant to purchase an additional, well, $3.5 million, I think it's $3.5 million worth of more vehicles. We're committed to buying 20 more vehicles as part of our pilot program, and we're committing to continue to explore electrification and alternative fuels. So we think it's important, but we definitely think it's tough because it does come at the expense of other things. So it's kind of a weird balancing act. It's a very weird relationship.
Can I offer one practical example of the first part of what Greg's talking about with more, and that is that getting here today, I'm a daily transit rider. Was planning to take the bus here. There are 2 routes that come here, the 3 and the 29, and when I mapped it out, I just used the Google thing, it really wasn't going to work, and that's in part because of the lack of frequency. Because I couldn't take the chance of a connection, and if the connection didn't work, getting here late for this. So I had to get a ride, but it's certainly on a route that would otherwise be well served and well used. And so that's one of the things. We do talk about the fact that, you know, we look at RIPTA compared to, you know, other transit agencies in terms of ridership, and we sometimes complain that we've got 2.7% of our state's population that uses transit to commute daily, which is a pretty small percent. Massachusetts, just by comparison, is about 10%. Connecticut, statewide, is about 6%. And Rhode Island is the 2nd most urbanized state in the country. And if we can't make a first-class transit system work here, there's something wrong. And a lot of it is a function of the resources that are available to make the system work for more people. We've got the people, we've got the density. But if the frequency is not there, guess what? People don't use it. And anyway, so that's just one example. Somebody else had a question. Jim Salenza.
Jim Salenza. I think there's secondary aspects to more of something and less of other things. More of the transit is there are connected relationships between that and other public health issues like obesity, heart disease, a whole range of health impacts aside from the climate issue, greenhouse gas emission issue. So you have a set of impacts from our current system, which has definitely, we know from public health studies in the last 30, 40 years, has increased obesity, has increased diabetes, has increased a major impact in terms of having 40 or 50% of our children under the age of 15 obese or have and later impacted by the heat. So more of something means less of another thing, and the less of the thing is the built environment that is reinforcing behaviors and activities, and certainly the issue of social class in a big way. If you look at where supermarkets are, and the province has struggled with this for a number of years, a lot of the food marts in inner city neighborhoods have really crappy food, right? It's a lot of sugar-based, and a lot of the interest in looking at food health is to bring in the capacity for healthier food options in those communities. But the people in those communities tend to are public transit. So there's a connection between, if you have a good, robust, frequent system, someone can go shopping 3 or 4 times a week to get good quality fruits and vegetables. Whereas if they don't have a good frequency system, they go maybe once a week, but then they pack up on carbs and stuff which their kids want. So I think there's more of something means less of something. And I think that's what actually public health is about. It's about more of this, and from the public health point of view, where I work, transit and transit development would be a public health goal.
Good point. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that it is the closing time, but so for anybody who needs to leave, feel free to do so. But anybody who would like to stick around and have more discussion, you're welcome to do that too. One of the points that I wanted to make is just as a follow-up to the issue of the example here, is that in my opinion, and I'll say this, you can reinforce me or not, but that RIPTA concentrates its service where it's going to move the most people, right? So if you look at the R line that runs from Cranston to Pawtucket, that's the most heavily used line. Frequency is every 10 minutes. That's probably what it should be, right? Because you're, compared to here on Sandy Lane, maybe the density isn't the same, and so it's not going to provide as much of a benefit. So I'm not taking issue with the lack of service here. I think that you have the pie is so big, and you deploy it where it's going to move the most number of people. But I think that it's safe to say across the board, as a frequent rider, and it's not just from home to work, but we probably need 30% more service on the street, period.
Oh, absolutely.
As a minimum.
We did an exercise, it's been a couple of years, we did an exercise where we looked at, we have service standards that we set for ourselves that basically say, like, what's the service that's required by specific, characteristic in the neighborhood, and whether or not we meet those standards. And then we did an analysis, well, what would it cost us? And just out of the gate, if we're a $120 million agency, it would have cost us $12 million to even meet our service standards, let alone add new services. So we're already down by about 10% where we want to be.
And what's happened over the years, just as context, is that RIPTA is solely reliant upon the gas tax for its funding. And the gas tax, for a long time, for many years, remained at a certain level. And it was not tied to cost of increase or inflation at all. So over time, its purchasing power became less and less and less. Add to that fuel efficiency standards, add to that the introduction of more electric vehicles that aren't using gas, that aren't paying for gas, and you can see what happens to their budget. So it's been a declining source of revenue. At the same time, there's been increased calls for more service.
Yes.
And Quonset is one of the most recent ones where there's been enormous pressure to provide greater service to Quonset. But if they just flip the switch and do that tomorrow, it's going to come at the cost of service someplace else. And we're talking about a state that's already, 2.7%. What would it look like in this state if we brought that number on par with Massachusetts? If we had 10%, what would that mean in terms of congestion? What would it mean in terms of reduced, greenhouse gas emissions? What would it mean in terms of contributing to the revitalization of downtowns across the state? I mean, Providence has done pretty well when it comes to revitalization. The cranes in the sky, there's a lot of activity. But when you look around at other places around the state, Woonsocket, Pawtucket, that's sustained enormous losses over the last few years. West Warwick. I mean, these are places that could use some added investment. But the sort of the appeal from a real estate development standpoint, without having, better transit, there's going to be a private service starting commuter rail from Woonsocket to Providence in a little over a year. And it's going to be limited, 4 or 5 runs from Woonsocket to Providence in the morning, 4 or 5 runs back. Now that may move things in the right direction, but we don't have anything close to the level of service that's required to help sustain these communities. So, thank you all for coming. And